Hello, I'm Greg with Brownlow Rights. A recent video that I did on primer methodology, so how to go about putting a primer into your brass. The secondary discussion that we need to have with that is the action itself. The action plays a tremendously important part in the ignition process. Without the firing pin hitting the primer, nothing happens. If that process doesn't happen exactly the correct way every single time, so not only does it have to be right, it has to be uniform, which means that all of the pieces of the action have to move exactly the same way, delivering exactly the same amount of force every single firing event. Every time we fire a round, that action needs to do the same thing every time. Without that, we will not have ignition uniformity. It doesn't matter how precisely we've placed each primer in every single one of our rounds. If our action is doing something different every time, then our ignition is not going to be reliable or repeatable. One of the topics of ignition timing that comes into play is the concept of pinfall. Now, this is how far away the firing pin is in the cocked location. So when our rifle is cocked and we have the bolt closed and we're ready to fire, how far away from the end of the firing pin's travel is the firing pin actually located? How far away is that then from the primer? You've seen my previous content describing to you how important other factors, such as headspace, for instance, are in the positioning of our primer. So how far the firing pin is allowed to move within our mechanism is called pinfall. And typically speaking, most actions, you want to have about 250 thousandths of pinfall. The longer the firing pin will travel, the more inertia will be delivered. Because obviously mass, the firing pin, the cocking piece, those objects that are in motion, if we weighed them, well, the longer that we had them in motion, building velocity across that distance of pinfall, the harder it would technically hit the back of the primer. So the amount of pinfall is directly related to the amount of inertia energy, the amount of impact energy that we're going to deliver to this primer. In the previous video on this subject, I explained to you how we need the velocity of impact in order to get these primers to ignite reliably. Pinfall is a very important aspect of this whole operation. Along with the pinfall, we can talk about the spring rate. The firing pin has some geometry in the front of it that the firing pin spring rides against. On the rear side, then, the firing pin spring is riding up against the bolt shroud. These two surfaces are what the firing pin spring is trying to push apart. Now, this is simply how much force the spring is applying. The spring, based on the size of its wire, the coils themselves, and the shape that the spring is made into, a lot of different things affect the spring rate here, but it's essentially an amount of force that the spring is applying to some mechanism. Now, this is a term that's measured in pounds of force. Are going to be somewhere between 22 and 32 pounds of force. If you consider the firing pin's size, the firing pin tip is like 60 or 80 thousandths in diameter. 100 and so thousandths would be like a really thick one. And that is a tremendous amount of pounds per square inch that is delivered to that firing pin tip once this mechanism has traveled forward and hit something. The other issue here is the surfaces. There's a lot of different things that are contacting inside of our bolt. How do those surfaces move past one another? Is there friction? Is that friction uniform every single shot? So folks, there is an absolute ton going on in here. We're not going to dive into the absolute nitty-gritty of tuning these actions or timing them. I'm simply going to educate you on what the parts are, which surfaces are rubbing up against each other and where, and then how to maintain our ignition system in these rifles. So how to properly clean and lubricate these bolts. Here is a standard 700 style bolt. Now there are some differences depending on the make and manufacturer of your action, but we'll start with just going over the anatomy of a typical bolt, and a lot of this is going to be the same regardless of what action you're using. So we'll start up here. This little tip protruding out past the bolt lugs is the bolt nose. So this is where our bolt face recess is. So bolt nose is here. Our bolt lugs then are here in this section. Our bolt body goes from the back of the lugs back here to our handle. Now on the handle, we've got some specific little features in here. First off, the handle is mostly this bit right here towards the bolt. Now this is what we would call a one-piece bolt. So that means the handle and the bolt body and the lugs and nose and everything here is one piece of billet. It starts out as one piece of steel. That means this handle is not soldered or welded or pinned or something like that on here. It's actually the same piece of material that this is. Back here we can see some Cerakote that Primal Finish did. There's a distinction here between the bolt handle and the bolt knob. Right about here, there is a transition where this bolt knob then, which is this part out here on this particular action, that starts right here. Now right here on the front of this bolt handle is our primary extraction cam. Now this cam surface right here interacts with this surface on the action itself. This is what gives us the mechanical advantage when we're lifting the bolt to pop that case loose from our chamber. Just behind the bolt handle is our bolt shroud. So from this line here all the way back to here, this is the bolt shroud. The extractor here is got the little claw portion on it. Now that's what actually grabs the case rim. The extractor is of course spring loaded. There's a spring that sits right underneath here on this particular design. It pivots on that roll pin there. When you chamber your cartridge on this push feed action, it depresses the ejector plunger. That's the little shiny plunger over here on this side, and it is spring loaded as well. That's what does our ejection. When we close the bolt on this push feed action and it chambers the round, it depresses that ejector plunger, and then the extractor clicks over top of the rim. When it ejects then, the extractor stays in position. If we can look at that from the side, that spring-loaded ejector plunger pushes the case this way, and it pivots underneath that and gets dragged out and kicked out of your ejection port on your action. To see the rest of the pieces, we flip the bolt over, and you can see our cocking piece is sticking out of the bottom of the bolt shroud. We're going to begin disassembly of the bolt now, and I'm going to use the Klein-endorsed tool. This is a nice little takedown tool that allows us to do this. It's called a Klein-endorsed tool, and that can be found on Brownells or various other places. So we just insert the bolt shroud here, and we hook the cocking piece with our little hook on top here, and then we cam this over, just like this. Now when we do that, it pulls the cocking piece back away from the rear of the bolt body. Now while we're here, I want to show you the cocking cam. Now this is a feature of the bolt body, and our cocking cam is that ramp right there. When a rifle is in the cocked position, this cocking piece sits back here like this. When it's fired, when we depress the trigger and we fire it, the cocking piece goes forward to the decocked position. When we cycle the bolts, when we lift the bolt handle up, what's actually happening is that cocking piece is riding up that ramp, just as I've just shown you. It rides up that ramp like that. So let's go ahead and use our tool here. We'll just take our fire control group out, Now that we have that ignition system removed, you can see our firing pin, which goes underneath the firing pin spring all along here. It travels through the bolt shroud and into the cocking piece. We've got another tool here, and I'm just going to thread our bolt into this. This little tool has to go all the way up on the firing pin here, and we're going to compress the spring. There we go. I've got the pressure off of our Kleinendorf tool, and now you're going to see as I continue rotating this that our cocking piece is going to get pushed all the way out the back. And you can see there our cross pin that holds the cocking piece onto the firing pin. We'll save our pin there. Now this level of disassembly is generally not required. Okay, we got that off. So we'll take our cocking piece and it just drops out the back there. Our bolt shroud here. We'll set it aside. And we've got our firing pin and firing pin spring inside here. Now let's go ahead and take out our ejector plunger and our extractor. So we'll use an ejector plunger removal tool. This just compresses the ejector and you rotate it. The rear of the lugs hold the tool in place. We'll set it on our little V-block here. Use our roll pin punch and knock that roll pin out. Then we rotate our tool and be very careful not to shoot our ejector plunger all over the room. And there is our ejector plunger and ejector plunger spring and our roll pin for it. Now, you won't often have to take your extractor out, but this process is very much the same. You just take your roll pin punch, you drift the pin out the bottom, and then hold the spring pressure off of the tool, and the extractor will just come out. Now, this is a mini M16 style extractor, as I mentioned, and so if you need to, you can take a Q-tip and clean the pocket down here and get any of the crud out of that slot to maintenance your extractor. We'll go ahead and put it back in now, and it's a very simple process. We've got our roll pin underneath here. We'll take our roll pin and I'll just kind of set it in here, and while pushing on this, I can just give it some wax. That'll get it started. Then I can grab my roll pin punch and drift that pin through there. Now we don't want the pin sticking out one side or the other. We want it to basically be equidistant from this side of the hole to that side of the hole. So you would just keep drifting it across until we get that equidistant position. To put the ejector plunger back in, we'll do the same thing in reverse. So position this. There's a little notch right here you can see in that pin. It's not completely round. There's a little notch. That's where the pin goes. So we orient the ejector so that we can get that pin back in there. We'll grab our tool, rotate like so, grab our pin. Oh, that's not our pin. This is our pin. Press it in a little bit and drift it. Same thing, about halfway between the front and the back. We kind of overdid it there a little bit. So we'll give that another whack. There we go. It's about equidistant there. So now we've got our ejector plunger back in. Obviously, when that's out, you can clean the hole. If you want, you can clean the bolt face. You just grab a Q-tip there. You can just grab a Q-tip and scrub that in the bolt face. Now the rear is where we've got some interfaces that happen with our ignition system. So the first thing you can clean is our cocking ramp. And then we can get some cleaning of the threads in here. Now those threads, of course, is where our cocking piece threads on, and you can see that there's plenty of grease on our cocking piece. Now this engagement has a lot to do with our bolt lift. So if you can't take your cocking piece and just thread it in here very easily when it's out of the rifle, then the chances that it's going to be smooth when you're lifting the bolt is next to none. Because remember, when it's in the rifle, we're moving our bolt like this. So when we go to lift the bolt, it goes thusly. So if that doesn't feel smooth and effortless when it's out of the action like this, then it certainly won't feel smooth when it's in the action. So the key thing here is just to make sure that this engagement is clean. And so you don't want a bunch of burrs hanging out on this, and you don't want all kinds of material, foreign material in here. You want this little track, this little passageway in here to be very smooth. And when you're maintenancing, you just clean up all the grease on this thing. And if it starts grabbing any fuzzies off of your Q-tip, well then you know that there's some work to be done here, because you don't want this to be super sharp. It will smooth out with time. Now we grab our cocking piece here, and we'll do the same thing. We'll give it a good cleanup. And I'm just looking to make sure that I get all the junk off of it. Because in order to move freely, this thing's got to be nice and clean. Now our cocking piece sits in the bolt like this. And so this is at the 6 o'clock position. It would be down that sits, okay? Now let's take a look at a trigger for a moment. So the cocking piece and the trigger relationship are very important. If I press the trigger now, nothing happens because there's no pressure on this thing. If I depress the trigger when there's pressure coming in from the top here, you can see nothing happens now, but if I press the trigger, it falls. So the sear falls down into the trigger, falls away. So you can see this slanted surface here and this little section back here. Well, if we grab our cocking piece, you can see they just kind of fit right in there. So when you're firing this thing, that's what happens. The sear goes down into the trigger, allowing the cocking piece and the firing pin, which is attached to it, to travel forward. The reason that's important to understand, here is our firing pin, and this firing pin is on this cocking piece, like so. Our firing pin, our cocking piece, and our bolt shroud have a lot going on here. So let's take our firing pin and put it through here. The firing pin has a contact point inside the bolt shroud right here. If I push that out the back and I get our cocking piece into the equation, see the cocking piece slides inside the bolt shroud, thusly. So if this movement is impeded in any way during the firing event, then we will not have consistent ignition. So all of these surfaces have to be very finely machined and treated properly, not just geometrically, so the relationship between where this sits and the trigger, but the movement of these pieces. It has to be silky smooth with no real resistance. They have to glide past each other wherever, in whichever direction, easily. Now, during reassembly, I'm going to talk to you about the different contact surfaces here. Obviously, this is the firing pin tip, and that's going to hit the primer. So the first set of contact surfaces that's happening here is between the firing pin and the spring. So if this firing pin spring is not properly fit to the firing pin, it can bulge and move around under compression. So instead of moving and collapsing straight, it'll collapse on itself. It will grind on the firing pin, and that would not be good. We're going to take our tool here, insert our firing pin and spring, and try to bolt shroud back in there, and now I'm just going to tighten this up again. Okay, now we're going to align our pinhole to the side. Put our cocking piece back on there, and cocking piece pin. And we're going to reinsert that. And again, we don't want this thing dragging on one side or the other, so we want to make sure it's beneath flush. And it is. Now we'll loosen our tool up. You can see it drawing our cocking piece down. Now I can unthread this like so and use our Kleinendorf's tool again. And remove this entire fire control group. Before we reassemble this, I'm going to re-grease these threads here. I'm not going to get any grease on the spring or the firing pin. That's very important. No grease down here, but up here on the bolt shroud only. So I'm going to grease this area right here. I like this Slip 2000 EWG Extreme Weapons Grease. Comes in a nice little needle applicator here. So I'm just going to get some grease on these threads. And the idea is I'm going to get all of these threads good and coated with grease. A little bit back here, a little bit here. So once I've got grease there, I'll just kind of take my finger and make sure that it's distributed effectively on the various surfaces. I'll put a little bit back here on this side. Definitely do not want any down here, the 6 o'clock position. You'll see why here in a moment. So once I'm happy that I got that greased, we'll go ahead and thread our ignition system back in, and I'm going to thread it in here, and then I'm going to thread it back out a few times. I'm just going to distribute that grease all along in there. Get the threads nice and coated. Make sure everything is running. As you can see, it takes next to no effort. Obviously, you need to start in the thread, but it takes next to no effort to do this. If it's hard to move, well, then you have problems. Okay. Now, I'm going to grab just a little bit of that grease off the threads. See, I'm just getting a little bit on my finger there. And I'm going to wipe that right on that cocking cam. The cocking cam on the bolt body that we mentioned earlier. I'm going to grease the back of that, and I'm going to grease the back of the bolt body here. You can see by the Cerakote's presence, there's nothing really contacting it there. But I'm going to put some there regardless to keep everything running smooth. I definitely do not want any grease on the 6 o'clock position of my bolt. So nothing along the 6 o'clock position of the bolt body. The reason we don't want any grease on the 6 o'clock position is because it will get deposited to the next round in your magazine. So the bottom of your bolt, the next round that's sitting in your magazine is going to be swiping a layer of grease across that. When you chamber that round and subsequently fire it, the grease that's on the outside of your brass, not only is it going to inhibit the brass from grabbing a hold of the chamber walls, giving you all kinds of terrible problems like massive amounts of bolt thrust and pressure signs on your case head, but when it expands in your chamber, it'll smush that grease around the entire perimeter of your chamber, coating the entire chamber in grease. Now your next round that you fire will be even more overpressure than the first. Not only is it going to be taking up space and essentially making your chamber smaller, it's also going to be lubricating your brass, which is the opposite of what we want to happen. Now, some of you are lubricating your brass after you clean your rifle because you're not cleaning out your chambers effectively. None of this is good, folks. So keep the grease off the 6 o'clock position on your bolt if you've got a single feed magazine. If you've got a stagger feed magazine where the rounds are coming up on the right and left side, well, then there's a much larger area on the bottom of your bolt that you need to keep free of any lubricants or grease. Now it's time for my secret weapon, silicone. Now this is where I take the bolt assembly here, the fire control group, and I'm going to put some silicone on the firing pin. And you'll notice that there's a ton on here now. It's just dripping with this stuff. So I'll just shake this into the garbage and use a rag to wipe off the excess, because the silicone on here is being deposited by the coil. And once I've completed that, I'm going to grab my Clinador's tool. I'm going to let the pressure off there and give it another squirt of silicone. I want this coil to transport that silicone in between the firing pin and the bolt shroud. And I'll just work it back and forth like that. You can even give a little shot of silicone right inside here. And that will make sure that the coil is going to work its way down in between the contact surfaces between the bolt shroud and the cocking piece. And you can just use the cocking piece and your Clinador's tool here to rub that back and forth. So once I'm happy with that, I'll make sure the excess is completely removed. Obviously, I don't want so much excess on here that it's going to drip down into the trigger. So it's very important that you get the excess off. You can even let it just hang like this, and then all of the excess will run down over time. So I've got that complete. We'll go ahead and thread our ignition system back in the bolt, leave it in the cocked position, and take our Clinador's tool off. Grease the 12 o'clock position on the rear band contact area. You see this slicked up portion of the bolt back here. So put a little grease in that area. And the primary extraction cam. I'm going to dab a little bit right on the primary extraction cam here. And you can see the silverish areas, the contact surfaces. The sides of our bolt lugs. I'm going to put a little bit there, not a ton, at the top and bottom. I'm going to put enough to make sure this thing glides effortlessly in the rails of the action. I'll put some in the anti-bind rail here. I'll just scrape a little bit off in the anti-bind section. And then I'm going to smear some on the back of the bolt lugs. And this is going to protect my lugs from galling. And once I get to this point and I'm all greased up everywhere, I'm going to cycle this bolt in and out of the action several times. I'm going to make sure this grease gets distributed through the action. Then I'll take the bolt out and wipe off the excess everywhere. And I'll just keep doing that until I get the right amount of grease left in the rifle, which is just a very thin film, but I need kind of a little more than I want on the bolt body in order to transport it into the action in all the different places that I want it. So I'll clean the action out, and then I'll use the grease on this bolt to re-grease the action. After I've cycled it a bunch of times, I'll take the bolt out, wipe the excess off, put it back in the rifle, and cycle it a bunch more, and then take it back out, wipe off the excess. And I'll just repeat that until I get the right amount of lubrication on everything, the bolt and the action. So this is a bolt from a BAT CT action. I just wanted to show you guys a different bolt of a different design. A couple of primary differences here on this bolt. Still a one-piece design, so the handle is the same as this piece here, but the extraction system is different. This is a Seiko style extractor. And then we've got a bayonet style fire control group. So instead of unscrewing it like I did the other one, I just twist it like that. And the entire thing comes out without tools. And you can see how the firing pin, instead of being pinned onto our cocking piece, it is threaded into the cocking piece and then has this little set screw here to hold it in. Now, a lot of you use grease on certain areas of your bolt that are very sensitive to this kind of thing. And if it's very hot outside, well, the grease will have a higher viscosity and it'll allow that firing pin to travel forward faster. If it is cold outside, well, then the grease will be very sticky and it will kind of grab a hold of every surface that it's on. And the firing pin won't move forward as fast in that case. We need to get you guys maintaining your bolts correctly in order to ensure that your ignition timing is not being changed in the condition that you're in, or attracting a bunch of debris and sticking it in there. And folks, you wouldn't believe the condition that I've seen some bolts come in here. There was a shooter in northwestern South Dakota. Him and a couple of his buddies stopped by here. And one of those guys had a rifle system. It had quite possibly the dirtiest firing pin assembly that I had ever seen in my career. I popped the ignition system out of this bolt, and the firing pin and firing pin spring, you almost couldn't see that there was a spring there. He had greased this thing up with something extremely heavy. Folks, it looked like paper mache or wet cardboard or something like that. It was just packed in there. And wouldn't you know, the complaint was that this rifle wouldn't shoot. And who would have guessed? Because, folks, that firing pin spring needs to move freely, and it can't be dragging on the firing pin at all either. The two angled engagements between the sear and the cocking piece are under great pressure. These surfaces being in contact would allow a liquid to crawl from the cocking piece down into the sear. From the sear, then, it would continue migrating down through the trigger, and it essentially, if you allow some dust to fly around and you're out hunting and some dust is flying around on a windy day or whatnot, just hauling it around in your pack will get some dust on it. That interface right there can really attract a lot of goo. And if that gets down into your trigger, then you're going to have all kinds of problems with your trigger malfunctioning. Because if your trigger parts get gooey inside there, then they're not going to move the same way every time. So the same extension of the problem that we have in our bolt is double true for the trigger. They're under small spring loads rather than large, heavy spring loads. And they're very tiny, intricate little pieces. So it doesn't take much debris to stop triggers, especially of the design that we have in these precision rifles. The battle-hardened open designs that you see in auto loaders oftentimes, they can take a lot more grime. It's best not to get any junk in there in the first place. So we don't want any lubricants finding their way down into our trigger. Now, this is also why when we're cleaning our rifles, we use a two-piece rod guide that seals off our chamber, and we be careful not to drool any cleaning junk. And so the solvents and the different liquids that we use when we're cleaning our bores, we don't want that to drool down our rod guide and forward into the action, because that stuff can get on the trigger. Now, another mistake that people make, and this is often as a result of living in the suburbs, they clean their rifles and then they go and store them vertically with the recoil pad down. So all that stuff that they cleaned the barrel with, they think they got it all out, but they didn't. It just drools out their chamber and runs down their action and finds its way into their trigger and goos up their trigger. So folks, if you have the opportunity to shoot your rifles after cleaning, that's very good. But at the very least, use a alcohol swab or something like that to clean your chamber. Maybe push a very light alcohol swab down your bore after you clean it. Now, that's not going to be very good for the bore's finish, so you might want to use a very, very tiny amount of Croil on a patch and push that through the barrel, very last thing that you would do. But better than that, I like to push a patch of Croil, and then I go shoot the rifle. So I use an oversized brush, and I wrap an oversized patch around that, and I squirt it with alcohol, and I clean the chamber of my rifle. because I don't want to have a bunch of goo in there and then go fire rounds because it'll cause overpressure for starters. So I make sure the chamber is spick and span clean, and I use some alcohol to make sure it gets dried out properly. This is after I push that patch of Croil. Then I go shoot the rifle like 10 times. I'll confirm my zero. I'll confirm that whatever zero shift was induced by the cleaning, which if you use the Croil patch, like I mentioned, is going to be minimal point of impact shift on a good barrel. But then the Croil patch shooting it, well, after 10 rounds, I'm perfectly zeroed. I use my Kestrel and make sure I get a good ballistic zero in the wind, whatever condition is present, even if it's 1 mile an hour. I'll record that in the Kestrel, and I'll be looking for my bullets to impact opposite that, and I'll put my rifle away, fouled, and zeroed. Now, this will make sure none of that cleaning goo comes running back down into my trigger and messes up my wonderful ignition. As you can see, this whole ignition thing is way deeper than just what we're doing with our primers. It's way deeper than just what we're doing with our bolt. Everything in our ecosystem has to be taken into account if you expect to have your rifle igniting these rounds the same exact way every single time. Our scripture reading today comes to you from John the Baptist. Now, this is just very shortly before he meets Jesus for the first time, and eventually John baptizes Jesus in the river. So this is Matthew chapter 3, and we'll do verse 7 here is where I'll start. But when he saw many Pharisees and Sadducees coming to watch him baptized, he denounced them. Now, this is John the Baptist talking here. He said, "You brood of snakes," he exclaimed, "who warned you to flee the coming wrath? Prove by the way that you live that you have repented of your sins and turned to God. Don't just say to each other, 'We're safe, for we are the descendants of Abraham.' That means nothing. For I tell you, God can create children of Abraham from these very stones. Even now, the axe of God's judgment is poised, ready to sever the roots of the trees. Yes, every tree that does not produce good fruit will be chopped down and thrown into the fire." John the Baptist is one of my favorite guys from the Bible because he doesn't spare anybody the truth. So when he encounters someone, he takes it upon himself to make sure that they understand the truth, that they know what's coming, and he ended up being right. A lot of people thought that John the Baptist was just a crazy loony wandering in the wilderness, and no one really gave him the respect that he deserved. But there was a few that were also aware of the coming of Jesus that did give him respect. Now, this could have been just God dropping this into their hearts. I'm not sure, and the Bible doesn't really say, but there were those that did respect what John had to say. This part here is just a very awesome piece of scripture because it deals with the fruit. And Jesus hadn't begun his ministry yet, folks. Later in the New Testament, we learn directly from Jesus himself. The very things that John was saying here are indeed true. Jesus' teachings follow exactly what John was saying. We will be judged by not what we say, we'll be judged by what we do. And any person that is not producing good fruit, that means that they're not laboring to serve others. They're not helping others. They're not using the gifts that God gave them. It says here that they will be chopped down by the root, meaning that they will be cut off at the lowest possible point and cast into the fire. Now, for those of you that aren't paying attention, that's hell, okay? What John is talking about here is if you're not producing good fruit, and always, then you are going to end up in hell. So that doesn't mean that we can just say, well, we're the sons of Abraham, that we're followers of Jesus, so then we get to go to heaven. Jesus himself said on many occasions the very same types of things, that you will be judged by what you do here. And just because you say, I believe in Jesus, that doesn't save you. Your work, what you do. And this doesn't mean that our work alone can save us. No, of course, our work for Jesus is what saves us. So this doesn't mean you have to get up every day and toil and labor and do all these things. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking fruits of the Spirit. I'm talking works under God, works for Jesus, being guided by the Spirit into those works, giving yourself to them fully, with great expectation of all that you're going to help, all those who you're going to help by doing that work. That's what's being talked about here. It's not go to your job or you're going to go to hell. That's a common misconception here. And I also don't want you to think that it's by our works that we are loved by God, and that is not true either. But God does want to see His children performing good acts. He wants to see us taking care of one another. That's the kind of work that we're talking about here. Now, for me, that work comes in sharing these videos with you, sharing my knowledge with you. I get an idea from the Spirit for an invention, some new product that I think would help someone solve the unique problems that I have faced in this discipline that I think they'll probably face. And hopefully they can have an easier time overcoming it by the products that we can make as a result. That's what drives me. That's the fruit that we're talking about here. It's having a nice, very happy, joyful heart, a fulfilling walk with Christ. That's the Spirit at work in our lives. That's the work that John is referencing here and Jesus references later. Produce those good and right fruits so that during your life and at the end of it, you can be judged confidently, that you'll know you did your very best. Be joyful servants for the Lord. Happily rise each day and be excited to go to work on the things that you've been gifted with and gifted to do. Be excited. Get up anticipating your ability to serve God's glory, to show that glory for all to see Him reflected in your life in that capacity. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can listen to John the Baptist as you read the Scripture for yourself. You can listen to Jesus' words later in the New Testament and find that He's saying the very same things. You can listen to the words of Paul and the other disciples after Jesus was crucified and saved all of us. You can listen to the guidance that they were giving in their letters. It's very much the same thing, a very unified message all throughout the Bible. Do good works. Produce proper fruit. If you can manage to do that, not only will you experience a very joyful and fulfilling life, but you'll be right with God, right with Jesus, and right with John the Baptist in the process. I hope this message has helped you this week, and please pick up a Bible yourself and start reading, even if you don't know why you're doing it. Just start doing it. Crack open the New Testament and start reading the Scripture yourself. You definitely don't need me as a go-between between you and the Almighty. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful and blessed week.